Let's talk about workspace optimization. This is a topic that's intrigued me for a very long time because my undergraduate advisor, my graduate advisor, and my postdoc advisor had many things in common, including being great scientists, being kind people, and terrific mentors. But they had another thing in common, which always perplexed me, which is that their offices were a complete disaster. They had mountains of books, mountains of papers, mountains of all sorts of stuff, and yet all of them were extremely productive and could remain extremely focused in that incredibly cluttered environment. I'm somebody who doesn't like clutter. I find it very hard to focus in cluttered environments. And indeed, there's tremendous variation among people as to whether or not they can remain focused or whether or not they struggle to focus in physically cluttered environments. There's no right or wrong to this. But the question we should ask ourselves is, why were they all able to be so focused? And it turns out that the reason they were able to be so focused is that they all captured one single and yet fundamental variable of workspace optimization. And we'll talk about what that variable is. In fact, we're going to talk about what all the variables of optimizing a workspace are. Things like vision, things like light, things like noise in the room, whether or not you listen to music or not, whether or not you use noise-canceling headphones or not. We're going to talk about all of that, and we're going to do that in a way that you can optimize your workspace regardless of whether or not you are at home, whether or not you're on the road, etc. Because the last thing I would ever want to do is to create a situation where you find the optimal workspace and then you are a slave to that optimal workspace. That's just not the way the world works. What you want to do, or my goal for you rather, is that you will have a short checklist of things that you can look to anytime you sit down to do work. And you can think about the underlying variables that impact your brain and your body and allow your brain and body to get into the optimal state in order to learn, in order to be productive, and indeed to move through your work bouts in a very relaxed and pleasurable way while maintaining focus and while pursuing any of the number of things that you're doing. The first variable we want to think about in terms of workspace optimization is vision and light. From the time you wake up in the morning until about 6 or 7 or 8, sometimes 9 hours later, your brain is in a unique state. It is in a state of high levels of dopamine, a neuromodulator, and high levels of epinephrine, as well as hormones like cortisol and so forth. Without going into the biology of those things, they set your brain into a state of high alertness. And this is true whether or not you indulge in caffeine or not. I know some of you say, oh, I really don't wake up until the afternoon. I'm much more alert and focused in the afternoon. We will talk about that phase of the 24-hour day in a moment. But that early part of the day is a time of day in which, for sake of workspace optimization, being in a brightly lit environment can lend itself to optimal work throughout the day, not just during that early phase. And so, while on many episodes of this podcast, I've also emphasized the importance of getting morning sunlight in your eyes within 30 to 60 minutes of waking. Not as often, but now and again, I will also mention that it's important to light your daytime environment as brightly as you safely can. So if you are going to be doing work in this early, what I call phase 1 portion of your day, you want to have as much light and indeed as much overhead light shining on you as safely possible. Now, of course, you don't want it so bright that it's glaring and you have to squint, etc. But you want as much light as is safely possible. And you can do that a couple of simple ways. One is if you do own or you're in an environment where you have overhead lights, turn on those overhead lights. What's special about overhead lights for setting alertness is that the neurons in our eyes, which are called melanopsin ganglion cells, that's the fancy name, melanopsin ganglion cells are mainly enriched in the lower half of our retinas in our eyes and view the upper visual field. Those neurons send little wires to an area of our hypothalamus right above the roof of our mouth that creates a state of alertness. Now, early in the day, we want to be as alert as possible, and this phase 1 of our circadian cycle is when we are best at doing analytic, detail type work. So we're going to go into other aspects of workspace optimization that are important for phase 1, but during phase 1, again, within 0 to about 8 or 9 hours after waking, bright lights in your environment, in particular overhead lights, are going to facilitate focus. They're going to facilitate further release of things like dopamine and norepinephrine and healthy amounts of cortisol. And we want that to happen early in the day for a variety of reasons. For instance, we don't want that cortisol peak to happen too late in the day. That's actually associated with depression and insomnia and a number of things that we just don't want. So one of the things that I've done for my workspace is to make sure that when I wake up in the morning, I do go get my sunlight. If the sun isn't out, I turn on as many bright artificial lights as I can manage or tolerate, and then I go get my sunlight exposure. But once I set out to do some work, that all the overhead lights in that room are on, as well as lights in front of me. And that's, again, to stimulate heightened levels of focus and further release of these neuromodulators that I mentioned before, dopamine, norepinephrine, and epinephrine. Now, the way that one could do that could be a very low-cost way of having, for instance, a desk lamp and those overhead lights. If you're somebody that wants to take this to the next level, you can purchase a ring light, which is, I think those are mainly made for people doing selfie-type videos, for Instagram posts and things of that sort. Ring lights can be pretty cost-effective, and yet they're very bright, and they have the sort of bright blue light that is going to optimally stimulate those melanopsin ganglion cells. So some people I know will have a blue light or a bright LED on their desk in front of them. And indeed, I have one of these. I don't use a ring light. I use a light pad. The particular light pad I bought on Amazon. I can mention the brand, but again, I have no financial affiliation to them. This is the Artograph light pad. It's designed for drawing, and it says on it 930 lux. Lux is just a measure of brightness. So I place that on the desk in front of me, and I turn it on essentially throughout this phase one of the day. Even if I walk away from the desk, I tend to keep it on. It doesn't consume that much energy. And in that way, I'm constantly being bombarded with photons that keep my levels of alertness up, because the early part of the day is when I do the majority of that focused work. Again, you don't need the light pad. You can use a ring light, or you can simply use any kind of other lights that you might happen to have, artificial lights. For those of you that can place your desk near a window, and even better to open the window, that would be really fantastic. I don't have access to that. Why would I say open the window? Well, it turns out that sunlight is going to be the best stimulus for waking up your brain and body through this melanopsin to hypothalamus system. And by looking at sunlight through a window, it's 50 times less effective than if that window were to be open, mostly because those windows filter out a lot of the wavelengths of blue light that are essential for stimulating the eyes and this wake-up signal. So all of this rests on the premise that we need to be alert in order to do our work, in particular focused work. And I've talked about before in the habits episode, and I'm saying again now, that first phase of the day, that first 7 or 8 or 9 hours of the day is really the time in which our neurochemistry is primed for getting the most amount of focused, kind of challenging work done, where a lot of precision and detail is required. So you want to brightly light your work environment during that first phase. Again, from the time you wake up, try and get sunlight, but then even if you're going to get exercise or do other things, you want to get as much bright light in your eyes as you safely can, and then you want to light your work environment. Now, in the afternoon, starting at about 9 and continuing until about 16 hours after waking, you want to start dimming the lights in that environment. Now, you don't want to make it dark because you don't want to get sleepy at 2 o'clock in the afternoon unless you're going to take a brief nap, which I do and is perfectly fine as long as it doesn't interfere with your nighttime sleep. But the idea is that in this so-called phase 2 of the 24-hour cycle, from about 9 to 16 hours after waking, you want to bring the level of lights down a bit. And when I say down, I literally mean down. Having lights that are in front of you is fine, but overhead lights at that time are not going to be optimal for the sorts of neurochemical states that your brain wants to be in. The states that I'm referring to are a shift from the dopamine and norepinephrine that's highest early in the day to increases in things like serotonin and other neuromodulators that put your brain into a state that's better for creative endeavors or for more abstract thinking. Now, as we'll soon see, there are other things you can do to improve creative thinking and abstract thinking. And in fact, there are things you can do to improve analytic thinking. We will talk about those. Things that are distinct from light. But right now, we're just focusing on light. So what I recommend doing and what I personally do is I will turn off overhead lights in the afternoon. It's not completely dim. It's not completely dark. But I will start to reduce the amount of overhead light and just simply keep the light pad on and whatever other lamps I happen to be using. One thing we haven't talked about is screen brightness. This is highly individual. People have different retinal sensitivities. What I mean by that is everybody differs in terms of how bright they can tolerate their visual environment and their screen. And whether or not you are sensitive to light or not will depend on a lot of factors. Some of it is eye color. Indeed, people with darker color eyes generally can tolerate more bright light than others. I have green eyes. I am very, very sensitive to light. If I'm outdoors at a cafe or something and the table has any kind of reflective properties and it's a sunny day, I can barely see the person across the table from me unless I'm wearing sunglasses. Some people, other members of my family, for instance, have dark brown eyes and can just sit there and have a conversation without the need for sunglasses at all. So there's tremendous variation there. One or the other isn't healthy or advantageous necessarily. Just understand that you never want to be in an environment where it's painful to maintain looking at whatever it is that you're looking at. If something's painful to look at, it could be damaging to your eyes, so you do want to protect your eyes. Now, in this second phase of the day, since most of us are working indoors, but even if you're working outdoors, you want to try and get the amount of light reduced overall, but in particular that overhead light. And you also want to start reducing the amount of blue light that you're being exposed to. So somewhere around 4 or 5 p.m., which for me is, about 12 hours after I've been awake or 14 hours after I've been awake, I will turn off that light pad and start to transition the lights in my environment to more yellows and reds. Now, I can't always do this. I have friends that actually have converted their entire homes from blue light early in the day to red light late in the day. That's really cool and fantastic. I haven't done that. There's a cost to doing that, and it is optimal in terms of optimizing productivity and sleep and so forth, but it's not feasible for a lot of people. But what I do is I simply switch to using yellow lamps. I will turn off that LED in the later afternoon, again around 4 or 5 p.m., and I tend to wake up around 6 a.m. or so. I'll turn those off, and what I'll try and do also is I'll try and dim the screen that I'm working on so that I can still manage to see everything that I need to see, but it's quite a bit dimmer than it was early in the day. So that's phase 2 of the day, and that's how we want to think about light. And then I'll just mention, because I know there are people who are working in the middle of the night, there's phase 3, which is about 17 to 24 hours after waking. And I realize that for shift workers or for people that are pulling all-nighters or for students, oftentimes you need to be awake and studying in the middle of the night. I myself am somebody who for years would pull anywhere from 5 to 10 all-nighters per year. I still pull an all-nighter now and again because of deadlines and so forth. I don't recommend it. If you can avoid it, great. But many people just simply have to do this for sake of shift work or because of impending deadlines or procrastination or all of the above. If you're going to be doing work in that third phase of your circadian cycle, you really want to limit the amount of bright light that you're getting in your eyes to just the amount that allows you to do the work that you're doing. Because if you get light in your eyes that's any brighter than that, you're going to severely deplete your melatonin levels. You're going to severely shift your circadian clock, and it's effectively like traveling to another time zone. So if you stay up from 3 a.m. until 6 a.m. or 2 a.m. until 4 a.m. working on a term paper or something of that sort, and you're getting bright light in your eyes, you are effectively flying 6 hours to a different time zone, or at least that's what your body registers it as. And it can really throw your sleep and your metabolism and a number of other things out of whack. Now, there's an exception to this, which is if you really want to be awake, it can often be beneficial to flipping on all the lights in the room and keeping them really bright. One of the hardest things to do is to stay up all night studying when you're in a dim environment. So you have to determine the trade-off between whether or not you want to shift your clock or whether or not you want to get the work done. And I would say the ideal situation is to sleep at night and to do your work during the day and in the afternoon. But if you do have to be awake in the middle of the night, do understand that you want to dim those lights overall. You would not want to use that LED. You would not want to have overhead lights on unless you're really struggling to stay awake, in which case you want to get as many bright lights on as possible. So there are a couple tricks to all-nighters. I don't really want people pulling all-nighters unless they have to, but there are a few things that you can do without taking stimulants in order to stay up all night that can be beneficial, that maximize on your biology. One of them that's a little less commonly known is you can drink 32 ounces of water and commit to not going to the bathroom for 90 minutes at least. Turns out that there's a circuit that goes from your bladder, literally neurons that go from your bladder to your brainstem. And when you have to urinate, it makes you very alert, as many of you have probably experienced. This is actually what wakes us up in the middle of the night when we have to use the bathroom, is this circuit for alertness that goes from full bladder. It's signaled by the bladder being full to the brainstem. And this is the circuit that is disrupted in kids that have bedwetting issues. And there are a number of cognitive behavioral approaches to that. Sometimes bedwetting in very young kids is because this circuit hasn't developed yet. Most adults, fortunately, are not bedwetting, but you can increase the amount of alertness in your system and remain awake in the middle of the night by drinking a little bit more water than you normally would, and then refraining from going to the restroom. That certainly will lend itself to alertness. You know how difficult it is to fall asleep when you have to use the restroom, for instance. So that's one tool. The other thing is, again, to flip on as many bright lights in the environment as possible. And then, of course, people will rely on stimulants like caffeine or even more aggressive stimulants. That's not something I necessarily recommend. You'll each have to determine that for you. But if you do, in fact, have to use all-nighters for any reason, you can maximize this bladder-to-brain approach and the bright light approach. Okay, so that more or less covers how bright to keep your overall environment and how bright to keep your screen. If you really want to get nerdy about this, there is a free app called Light Meter where you can start measuring how many lux, how many photons are in a given environment. It's actually measuring reflectance of photons and so on. If you can look up what a lux meter does, if you like. I don't necessarily recommend doing that. I don't want to set a critical threshold by which, for instance, we say once your environment is more than 1500 lux, then it's too bright or not bright enough, etc. Everyone has different retinal sensitivities. Everyone will find that different levels of brightness will cause them to be alert. Different levels, dimness, if you will, in the room will cause them to feel sleepy. You really want to just modulate across the 24-hour cycle where it's very bright as it safely can be early in the day so that you are alert, focused, detailed work in that first phase. And then in the afternoon, as you move into more creative type works or abstract thinking or working with other people in kind of a brainstorming mode, that you would shift to dimmer lights, yellow lights, eliminate the blue lights as much as possible. Now that's light, but there's another aspect of vision that has been shown to be critically important for how alert we are going to be and how well we can maintain that alertness. And that has to do with where our visual focus is in a given environment. So I'm not talking about overall brightness. What I'm referring to now is simply where you place your phone or your tablet or computer screen or book, whatever it is that you happen to be looking at. There's a very underappreciated and yet incredible aspect of our neurology that has to do with the relationship between where we look and our level of alertness. And it works in a very logical way. We have clusters of neurons in our brainstem. And those clusters of neurons control our eyelid muscles and they control our eye movements up and down and to the sides. And indeed, if you were to look at an eyeball, I've looked at a lot of eyeballs in my lab, and I teach neuroanatomy, so we do this from time to time, we would see that there are 6 muscles attached to your eyeball. Now, 4 of them are located at the top, the bottom, and the 2 sides of your eyeball, sort of at the 12 o'clock, 6 o'clock, 3 o'clock, and 9 o'clock of your eyeball. And those muscles can move your eye in the socket from side to side and up and down. And then we also have some muscles that can actually pull the eyeballs at angles. Okay, so we have different muscles that can move the eyes at different angles as well. And that's why we can look up into the side or down into the side, not just from side to side or up or down. Now, the neurons that control those muscles have a very interesting feature, which is that when we are looking down toward the ground or anywhere below basically the central region of our face, the neurons that control that eye movement are intimately related to areas of the brainstem that release certain types of neuromodulators and neurotransmitters. And they activate areas of the brain that are associated with calm and indeed even with sleepiness. And there's an active inhibition or prevention of neurons that increase alertness. Now, the opposite is also true. We have neurons that place our eyes into an upward gaze above the sort of level of our nose and above our forehead, literally looking while keeping the head stationary. Or if you tilt your head back and you look up, these neurons are still active. Those neurons don't just control the position of the eyes and cause them to move. They also trigger the activation of brain circuits that are associated with alertness. This is a fundamental feature of the way that our eyes and brain are wired together and how they relate to what we call autonomic arousal. And there are a bunch of details there. We will actually have a guest in a few weeks who has learned to exploit these neurons and the fact that they control these different states of calm or alertness in order to generate hypnotic states, to place people into very atypical states in which they are both very alert and very calm. We'll save that for a future episode. But the important thing to understand is when you are looking down below the level of your nose, you are essentially decelerating your alertness. You're reducing your amount of alertness. It might be subtle, but it's happening. Whereas when you look straight ahead, or in particular when you look up, you are increasing your level of alertness. Now, this has some obvious implications. When we get sleepy, our eyelids tend to close and we tend to nod down. When we're wide awake, we tend to be wide-eyed. We don't tend to blink as often. And we tend to be chin up and kind of on vigilance and alertness. So this has a evolutionary or at least an adaptive component to it. This can be exploited, and indeed, it's been researched in terms of how it can be used to optimize work environments. Contrary to what most people do, which is to look down at their laptop, tablet, or phone, if you want to be alert and you want to maintain the maximum amount of focus for whatever it is that you're reading or doing, you want that screen or whatever it is that you're looking at to at least be at eye level and ideally slightly above it. Now, I haven't seen many workspaces that take advantage of this very hardwired neurobiological fact. So what should you do with this information? Well, if you're somebody who sits down to do work and starts to feel sleepy or simply unfocused, unable to attend to whatever it is that you're doing, I highly recommend that you take your laptop or tablet I do hope that most people aren't doing serious work on their phones because it's such a small visual window, and we can talk about why that's an issue later. And the idea would be to place that screen of your tablet or your laptop or other computer and try and get it elevated at least to nose level, your nose level, or even higher. Now, I realize that can be complicated to do. I've long just used a stack of books, or I'll sometimes take a box and turn it upside down and set it there. I do use a mixed standing seated desk. I'll talk about that in a few minutes. There are a number of different ways that you could do this. You could wall mount a monitor. I think many people are working with laptops. It's a little bit harder to do that with a laptop. Some people, though, will configure a second screen. You have to decide what's right for you and your budget. But again, in addition to having a brightly lit room to be able to focus and attend to whatever it is you're working on, you want to have that screen positioned high in your visual environment. Now, you wouldn't want it on the ceiling necessarily, although that would be pretty cool. But you do want it above you. Now, there are a couple solutions to this that don't involve a wall mount or stacking books or boxes. For instance, you could be one of those people that likes to lie in bed or on the sofa and get your screen up above you by putting pillows on your knees. I used to actually do a lot of my writing and work in the middle of the night. I don't do this anymore and I don't recommend it, but I used to do a lot of work from bed. Now I no longer bring electronics for work into the bedroom. I just really try and keep the bedroom for sleeping or whatever else. But in terms of lying down on the couch, it is somewhat easier to get that screen up above you. You can kind of slide underneath that screen and get typing. But there's a problem with that, and we'll talk about this a little bit more in a moment. But it turns out that your posture, literally the position of your body relative to gravity, also has important implications for how alert you are. So ideally, you would be standing or seated. I would say the ideal would be standing. Second best would be seated. And your screen will be either directly in front of you or slightly above you. Or if you wanted to get really fancy, you could create a situation where it was above you and slightly tilted toward you so that you actually had to maintain kind of proper neck posture. This accomplishes a number of things. In addition to making you more alert, you also get away from the so-called text neck. You know, people are starting to look more like C's nowadays, the shape of the letter C, because we're constantly looking down. I do every once in a while see somebody who's texting in public with it eye level. It always looks a little odd that they're doing that, but I always admire their posture at the same time, so we shouldn't give them a hard time. So this is another feature that you can arrange into your physical workspace. Again, whether or not you're seated or you're standing throughout the day, try and get that screen elevated. Now, with reference to posture, there are beautiful data illustrating that when we are standing up, those same neurons in our brainstem, locus coeruleus neurons, which release, I should mention, things like norepinephrine and epinephrine, those neurons become active when we are standing. They become even more active when we are ambulatory, when we are moving. And we will talk about treadmilling and cycling at your desk and so forth in a little bit. But when you sit, they become a little less active. And when you lie down, and indeed any time that you start to get your feet up above your waist or your head tilted back, those neurons fire less, and neurons in your brain that are involved in calming and indeed putting you to sleep start increasing their level of firing. It's a really beautiful system. So beautiful, in fact, that there are studies that show that as you adjust the angle of the body back, you actually get a sort of dose-dependent increase in sleepiness and calmness, and a dose-dependent decrease in alertness. And so, as we were all told, to sit up straight, or even better, to stand up straight, and now I'm also telling you to get that visual thing that you're attending to, screen or otherwise, up in front of you or ideally above you. Those things combine to generate maximum alertness. So you can think about how you might work this into various aspects of your homework environment or office work environment. But as I describe this, many of you are probably thinking what I'm thinking, which is, gosh, most of what we do is in complete opposite direction to all of this neurobiologically grounded advice. Most of us are looking down at our laptop while seated, or we are lying down, which is going to make us more sleepy, or we are positioning our computers in front of us, but we really aren't in an environment that's bright enough, and so on and so forth. So as you can tell, we're starting to layer in the various things that you can do. First, brightness in the room. Second, get that screen up, and try and put yourself into a posture for work lends itself or promotes alertness, if indeed you want to be alert for that work. If your goal is to take a nap, get your feet elevated about 10 to 15 degrees above your head, maybe put a pillow underneath it, lie down and take a nap. But that's not what we're talking about today. We're talking about workspace optimization. And I suppose you could also exploit that all-nighter trick that I talked about earlier. I actually did this when I was an undergraduate. I was a little bit masochistic in this way. I would drink coffee and water, fairly high volume. I wasn't, force drinking or anything like that. but I actually wouldn't allow myself to get up and use the bathroom except on a timer. So I think the longest I ever went was like 3.5 hours. It was kind of excruciating. I actually don't think that's necessarily a healthy advice. But again, you can use slight overconsumption of fluids in order to generate alertness. That was just me really trying to get as much work done as I could. I had a very, very demanding class schedule, and it was just the only way that I could get work done. If I was getting up every few minutes to use the restroom, I found it hard to re-engage in that work and maintain focus, which is what I just want to briefly mention now. I talked about this in the episode on focus, but one thing that is completely unreasonable and that you should never ask yourself to do is to sit down or stand up and immediately focus on something, unless you're stressed about what you're looking at or you're very, very excited by it. If you're very stressed about some sort of information or a deadline, or you're very, very excited about something, you'll find that you can focus instantly, just within a moment. And that's because of the deployment of neurochemicals like dopamine and norepinephrine that bring about our levels of alertness. However, most of us, including myself, go to begin a work bout and we'll find that our mind doesn't quite engage at the level of depth and focus that we would like right off the bat. I've timed this, and other studies have timed this in a more rigorous way. Mine is just what we call anecdata. So I've timed it for myself, but there are studies that have looked at this. And the data point to the fact that even at our most heightened levels of focus, most people can only maintain focus before switching tasks for about 3 minutes, which is depressingly short period of time. However, you can extend that period of time, and I've talked about that in the episode on focus. But more importantly, when you sit down to start a work bout of any kind, expect that it would take about 6 minutes for you to engage these neural circuits. You wouldn't expect yourself to walk into the gym and do a PR lift or start running and do your best sprint or just head out the door without warming up at all. A little walk jog at first or, a few warm-up sets. We expect that. We are not surprised that we need that. And yet we sort of expect that our brain should be able to lock on and do work in a very focused way immediately. And that's just a ridiculous assumption. It's an unfair assumption, I should say. So assume that it will take about 6 minutes to engage in your work bout, and that those neurochemical systems will take some time to rev up and engage. The other things that I'm describing about lighting and screen positioning and posture, those will also help maximize your focus and will limit that ramp up time into a focused state. And I think what you'll find is that as you maximize your workspace, the time, the latency, as we say, to get into that focus will start to shorten. It'll especially start to shorten if you use tools to limit distraction. We will talk about distraction, but things like Freedom, which is an app, a free app that allows you to lock yourself out of the internet, or turning off your phone, for instance. But even if you're doing work on your phone or that involves your phone or the internet, as many of us, including myself, do, expect there to be a ramp up time for you to focus. There's another aspect of our vision that's absolutely critical for optimizing our workspace, and that has to do with this really interesting feature of our visual pathways in that it has 2 major channels. Those 2 major channels have names, although you don't have to remember the names. The first one is the so-called parvocellular channel, which is involved in looking at things at specific points in space, high resolution or detail. And then there's the so-called magnocellular channel that's involved in looking at big swaths of visual space and lower resolution. So you can think of the parvocellular system as kind of a high pixel density. Think about your most modern smartphone, the recent smartphone with the best camera, and think about the magnocellular system as being lower resolution, kind of an older smartphone, lower pixels, etc. You might ask, why would you want a system that's low resolution? Well, the low resolution system is better at things like detecting motion and not so much at detail, and vice versa. Now, again, you don't have to remember the names. What you do have to remember, however, is that you're going to create the maximum amount of alertness in your system, the maximum amount of ability to focus when your system is in that parvocellular mode, when you're bringing your eyes to a common point, what we call a vergence. Vergence eye movements are incredibly powerful for creating heightened states of alertness and focus. And indeed, they create heightened states of cognition, of thinking. And that's because your brain follows your vision in terms of focus. When we say, I can't focus, what we often are experiencing is an inability to not focus visually. Whereas when we are in a very focused state, we are in a state often where we can focus visually. Now, we can also do this with our auditory system or to touch, etc. But right now, we're just talking about the visual system. Now, in terms of workspace optimization, what this means is we never really want to be looking at a square or rectangle or target area for our work that is too far beyond our ears. How far is too far? Really, you want to try and keep the blinders on, or I should say the invisible blinders, so that whatever you're looking at falls within the region of visual space in front of you that is present if you were to cup your hands and put them right next to your eyes. Now, this is a rough estimation, but I'm doing this now. For those of you that are watching on YouTube, I'm doing this now. I'm trying to simulate like a horse with blinders on. For those of you that are listening, just imagine me looking silly with my hands cupped near my eyes. But if we are to, for instance, look at a screen that's very, very big, and we're too close to it, or even if we're standing back from it, it's going to be hard for us to attend to everything within that screen space. So this is actually support for the idea of using a phone or a tablet or a laptop. My laptop is about 15 inches in diameter, I think, is the one that I have. Some are 13, some are 17. Some of you like to use big monitors. Make sure that whatever it is that you're looking at, if you want to remain focused, it doesn't extend too far beyond where your eyes are, the sides of your head, that is. So just think blinders on a horse. And actually, that's the reason they put blinders on a horse, so that they're not looking off into the periphery. Horses, unlike humans, don't have the same shaped pupil. They don't have a visual system that's organized in quite the same way. They mostly see in panorama, in magnocellular vision. And so those blinders are designed to keep their visual focus straight ahead, so they physically restrict it. Now, some people will actually go to lengths to further restrict their visual focus. They will do things like putting on a hoodie or wearing a hat, for instance, to restrict their visual window. And indeed, that works quite well. But as we'll talk about in a moment, when you really restrict your visual window down to a very, very narrow portion of visual space, that actually changes the types of information that you are best at processing. And we'll talk about that in terms of something that's called the cathedral effect in a few moments. But for now, here's the principle. Make sure that whatever you're looking at is directly in front of you and doesn't extend too far out to the side. Once you get out to, say, 6 or 12 or certainly 18 inches on either side of your eyes, you are dilating your gaze. By definition, you're dilating your gaze. It's completely subconscious, and it becomes very hard to maintain attention. Now, the caveat to this is that if you are going to look at a narrow space, a narrow window for any period of time, whether or not it's a book or a laptop or a tablet or a phone, those Vergence eye movements not only create alertness, but they also require energy. And they also can fatigue the eyes because there's a process called accommodation whereby the shape of your eye literally has to change so that the lens can move so that you can focus at that location. Accommodation is an incredible process, but it is a demanding one, and that's the reason that your eyes get tired when you focus on something for too long. So here's a principle extracted from the ophthalmology and neuroscience literature that you can adopt. For every 45 minutes in which you are focusing on something like a phone or a tablet or a book page or your computer, you want to get into magnocellular panoramic vision for at least 5 minutes. And the way that I suggest to do this is actually to take a walk, ideally outside. We're going to talk about ambulation, about movement, and about how that can maintain alertness throughout the day. So for every 45 minutes or so, try and get 5 minutes of relaxing your eyes. This is something that's not often done, especially in today's homeschooling and where people are where kids are going to school by Zoom and adults are working by Zoom. This is a serious problem. People are getting eye fatigue. They're getting headaches. Indeed, some people are getting migraines. They're having all sorts of issues, neck pain. Much of that, if not all of that in some cases, can be alleviated by this 45 to 5 rule. For every 45 minutes of focused work that you do, get 5 minutes where you get outside, or if you have to be indoors, where you can dilate your gaze. Now, some of you may be saying, well, that spits in the face of your 90-minute rule. You've told us before that we should focus for 90 minutes. I would still want you to take breaks within those 90 minutes if you're looking at a narrow piece of visual world, meaning at a phone or a laptop or so forth. And again, the best way to do this would be to go outside, just relax your eyes, look off into the distance. Looking at a horizon will automatically trigger this panoramic gaze, which is very relaxing to the eyes and will allow you to go back into a focused work bout. The one thing you absolutely do not want to do is to go outside and check your phone. Because if you're outside checking your phone or you're taking a break and checking your phone, you're still in that Vergence eye movement. Okay? So this is very, very important because Vergence eye movements increase focus and attention, and you can exploit that to increase focus and attention when you want to, but you absolutely need to relax the system. Again, for every 45 minutes in which you've been in that focused mode, you want to get at least 5 minutes of panoramic vision. If you can take a 15-minute walk, even better. So is it better to sit or is it better to stand when doing work, at least as it relates to focus and productivity? And the answer is both. There have been a number of systematic studies exploring what are called sit-stand desks. So these are desks that can be set to a height that makes standing the best practice, and then they can be lowered to a height that makes sitting the best practice, or the easiest practice, I should say. And it turns out that just sitting is terrible for us, okay? And there's an enormous number of studies out there that point to the fact that people who sit for 5 or 6 or 7 hours a day doing work have all sorts of issues related to sleep, neck pain, cognition suffers, there are a number of cardiovascular effects, even digestion. There may even actually be some almost pressure effects on the pelvic floor and things of that sort, depending on the chairs that one uses. But that people who stand are in a slightly better situation where many of those health metrics improve, but that people that do a combination of sitting and standing at the same desk throughout the day, or move from one desk to another if they don't have a combination sit-stand desk, that's going to be best. The good news is it's very easy to convert a sit desk into a stand desk. You can just stack some boxes. I've done this at times, or stack books. There are also some pedestals and things that you can purchase if that's your preference in order to set your computer at a particular height. And of course, there are desks that have motors, and there are ones that have cranks, and there are all sorts of variations, both in terms of the types and whether or not they have motors, as well as the costs to these things. So they can go from very low cost, like placing boxes or books create a standing desk, to very high cost in some cases. Now, what's interesting, if you look at the scientific literature, is that people who decreased their sitting time by about half each day. So they took, let's say they were working for 7 hours a day, 3.5 hours of that day they decide to stand, and it's not even clear that it matters that they do all those 3 hours in one bout, or they divide that up into shorter bouts of a half an hour and then sit for half an hour, etc., alternating back and forth, showed incredibly significant effects on reduced neck and shoulder pain, increase in subjective health, vitality in work-related environments, and perhaps most importantly, for sake of today's discussion, improvement in cognitive conditioning and the ability to embrace new tasks and cognitive performance. There are several studies that if one wanted to explore, they could explore this in more detail. I'll put a link to this as well. The article that I'm referring to is called Effect of Workplace Sit-Stand Desk Intervention on Health and Productivity. And I like this paper because many of the papers out there focus on the effects of sit-stand desks on health in trying to get people to burn more calories, improve their posture, relieve neck pain, slumped over, etc., but not on productivity. And this particular paper focuses also on the metrics of productivity. It has its own study and also references a number of important studies. What does this mean for you and me? Well, I've long used a standing desk or some variation thereof. What this means is that we should probably spend about half of our work time standing and about half of it sitting, but not all sitting or not all standing. If you had to do all one or the other, standing is going to be better than sitting. What happens if we just stand? Well, that can also generate some postural issues in terms of stabilization and fatigue. Everybody, at least in the US, is not getting sufficient cardiovascular exercise or movement throughout the day. And standing at one's desk can improve some of those health metrics and, again, can improve productivity, probably because of those postural effects that I talked about earlier, that when we lie down, there tends to be less alertness in our brainstem, if you will. There's less activation of those brainstem circuits involved in alertness. And indeed, the circuits that involve a kind of a calming effect on the body get activated. And as we become upright, standing or sitting, but especially standing, then those brainstem circuits for alertness kick on, which are going to make it easier to remain focused. If you are going to start standing for half of your work time, you will notice that it takes a few days to adapt. You'll notice a lot of shifting from side to side. You definitely want to wear comfortable shoes. Some people will do this on a wooden floor. Other people feel uncomfortable unless they're on carpet. You have to figure out what works for you, but it can take a little bit of time to adapt. I have to say, after now about 10 years of working at a sit-stand desk, I find I can't sit for too long before I want to stand, and my standing bouts can be anywhere from 30 minutes to 2 hours, although 2 hours would be a little bit long, and then I catch myself kind of leaning on the desk off to the side. So again, the idea is to stand but not be leaning on the desk. Obviously, if you're typing or you're writing, there'll be some leaning involved, but that's what the literature support. There is also a literature on whether or not physical movement under your desk, meaning treadmilling, or in fact, there are now bicycles that allow people to pedal. It's kind of a unicycle-like thing, although not a unicycle, under the desk, can be beneficial for workplace performance. So let's take a look at what those data say. There were no significant differences between cycling or treadmill workstations on any cognitive or typing outcomes. So it does not seem to matter whether or not people are treadmilling under the desk. So these would be stationary treadmills. It's like a little conveyor that people are walking on, sometimes very slowly. I'm guessing some people walk more quickly. The New Yorkers probably treadmill quicker. The Californians probably